Welcome to What's Next, previews, predictions, and prognostications. I'm your host, Rhett. Joining me is my co-host, John Baldoni. Hey, John. This is a show that examines what we do now and where we go to prepare for what's next. Whether you own a company, work for one, or you need information on what we can expect in the wake of COVID-19 and now what we're seeing happening in society. So you can come here to look at and get information on from thought leaders and people who are doing work to change the world of business, science, medicine, economics, media, and psychology. The people that we interview are going to help us shape the new normal in this sort of post-COVID-19 world. John, I'm going to let you introduce our guest and start off with the first question.
Great. Okay. Thank you. We'll welcome Terry Jackson, PhD, dynamic advisor, thought leader, and TEDx speaker, all-around good guy. Terry was a top Thinkers 50 as a top 50 coach. And he's a prolific author, has a PhD in management with a concentration in leadership and organizational change. He's the author of Transformational Thinking, the first step toward Transformational Thinking, the first step toward individual and organizational greatness. And I guess Terry won't be hiring me. Anyway, and our other guest is Jared Fishman, who runs the founder of the Justice Innovation Lab. Prior to that, Jared was a former civil rights prosecutor and who assists reducing racial disparities and improve the fairness of justice in this jurisdiction. Jared began his career in post-war Kosovo, which might even be a better place than we are this particular week. So welcome both of you. First question is to you, Jared, and that's, we seem to be in an inflection point and in terms of racial inequality and at least calling attention to it. If we are, why are we?
Well, I think, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. I do, in fact, think that we're at a crucial point where we could see some more systemic change than we've seen in the past. The reactions to George Floyd's murder definitely have resonated with a lot of people. I think we're seeing that murder, obviously it being quite shocking to watch it, having a visceral reaction to being able to watch that abuse that for many communities of color, no, it is happening quite frequently. This is just one that all of us get a chance to see. But in terms of the reactions, not only across the country, but across the world, I think we can't underestimate the role that COVID has had on this. COVID has exposed inequalities, particularly in the US, affecting communities of color, lower income communities. Economically, the economic downturn that we're going to see will disproportionately affect communities of color. It is exposed inequalities within the medical system. So I think we are seeing a lot of people being affected at the same time in a very visceral way. So I think this is an opportunity, much like COVID has dominated the news for the last 2 months, and now it is not dominating the news because we're talking about racial justice issues. The question is, how long will we talk about those issues, and what can we do right now while there is momentum? Because I think people are willing to reflect and think much more hard on the criminal justice system and inequality more generally.
Terry, thank you, Jared, for setting up my question to Terry, because that was a perfect setup. Terry, what is it going to take to sustain this effort? Because I don't want this to be, from a personal standpoint, I don't want this to be another news cycle and then we move on to back to normal and then something else happens and we have this moment and then we move on to another, to the next moment. How do we sustain the I don't want to say that the outrage, but the momentum that we see right now, and how do we sustain this? How do we sustain this moment and actually make change?
That's a great question.
It's an unfair question, but how do we do that? Because I think that we have to make some changes.
Right. I would agree. It's a great question because we've been here before,
Right.
but we haven't been here before, right? The distinctive difference is what Jared mentioned around COVID and the world coming to a stop and everybody the pace being slowed of the world. So when George Floyd happened, the world could see it simply because of how slow it was actually moving. And so people became outraged at that. So we haven't been at this moment before where the world has been so slow that it really couldn't believe what it saw. Now, we've been here before with all of the other unarmed African Americans who've been murdered by the police. However, nothing happened at those times because the world was moving so fast, right? So you're right. I don't want this to be the flavor of the day. And then a year from now or 6 months from now, nothing happens. And so I think the great thing about it is when I look at the protests, I look at the demographics of who's out there, right? You have a younger demographic, which has always been the young demographic around revolution and change, right? So you have a real young who are not in school, right? Because no school is in. And so you have the young demographic out there. And there's a lot of difference because of, for the last, I don't know, 30, 40 years, we've been in this desegregated school system. You have all kinds of people making friends. And now my friend is this guy here, and it really doesn't matter what the hue of his skin is, he's my friend. And so they're beginning to see that this my friend who was killed, or this could have been my friend. And so their voices become louder because they understand that it was simply because this guy appeared to be he's an African American, and that's the only reason. And what I'm going to call the malice of it all, because he's down there saying he can't breathe, and this guy doesn't let up. And so everybody is seeing this, and they're like, wow. So to sustain this, I think one, that visual has to remain in the eyes and the minds of everybody that's looking, especially those who are influencers who can speak up and have an impact on not only legislation, but on the political process, right? Because what we're really talking about is a legislative transformation around what has to happen around others who are treated unfairly and discriminated against simply because the hue of their skin or their gender or their ethnicity, whatever it may be, right? And we got to make the shift from the civil rights movement, and Jared, you may or may not agree with this. We got to make this shift at some point in time from the civil rights to the human rights movement, right? Simply because I don't know who civil is, but I know who a human is, right? And so I've never been a big proponent of titling it civil rights because we're dealing with human beings. And again, it goes back to the dehumanization and the objectification. So now, when you think of civil rights, you really think of African Americans because of the civil rights movement. If I term that human rights, then there's some equity in that because I'm saying that I see you the same way that I see me because I'm human. And so we got to make that shift, that narrative from civil right to human right. And when we make that shift, I think more people will buy into the sustainability of all of this.
Jared, do you want to jump in on that one to pick it up from that shift?
Yes, I mean, I think civil rights and human rights, we need all of it. I think what I, with a lot of focus on the criminal justice system and a lot of calls for some national action, what I worry about is that actually takes away from what is necessary in my mind to do the real work. We don't have one criminal justice system in America. We have about 10,000. Every jurisdiction, every county, every state, they're their own systems. And so when we're talking about reforming policing, that means reforming policing in your community, whether that's Minneapolis or Fargo, wherever Fargo is. Thank you.
We have 2 viewers in North Dakota. We just lost them.
But we need that change. And so in order to sustain it, we need people in whatever community is outraged to link up with other people in that community and demand changes. For those of us who are in positions of power, we need to be incorporating more different opinions in whatever decisions we're making. We need to go beyond just paying lip service and demonstrate a true curiosity as to why we have difference of opinions, why we have difference of backgrounds. Because when you're putting together a team that's going to make change, you've got to have a lot of different ideas and you've got to work off of each other in order to make that change. So what I would like to see is you're having protests in, I think, 140 cities across the United States. I would like to see those movements focus on their communities and focus on what can be done in those communities, because there's low-hanging fruit in every community. There are easy targets that can be easily get people motivated. And it's going to be different in California than it's going to be in Alabama. But the groups that care and want to address those issues, this is the time to team up, to partner up, and to use all the skill sets to make a difference.
A question for both of you in this, and that is, how do you have, as a company leader, I'm coaching a couple companies right now, and the big question is, how do I have a meaningful conversation about these issues with my team when you have a bunch of different opinions and a bunch of different worldviews, and politics, obviously politics is really dividing us right now. And if you have any team of any size, you've got some people who view things one way or the other. How do you have a meaningful conversation in these tough, and these are tough conversations sometimes. How do you have those as leaders right now, as an organization? I mean, what's the right way to start that conversation, I guess?
You know, Rhett, I think you and I were having a conversation one day around something very similar. Mm-hmm. And what I did was
why I asked.
What I did was I quoted to you a passage from Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail. And I said, we keep asking the question around, how do we do this? How do we position ourselves? We just need to act. When you see that incident of something that you might interpret to be discriminatory against anyone, you got to have the courage to speak out. You can't wait until you get home and you sit down and you have a discussion and say, well, here's what I saw. But the question should be, did you do anything? Did you speak out? Because there are incidences every day, regardless if it's discrimination based upon race, gender, ethnicity, doesn't matter. It happens in front of us on a day-to-day basis that we just continue to walk by and not say anything. So there has to be somewhat of a shift of the culture. And I can say that I'm guilty as well. I'll walk by certain things that maybe I should say something about. And so the awareness is here, but it takes action. You know, yesterday I was looking at a post someone made and said it takes empathy and compassion and this and that. And I says, yes, it does take that, but it takes courage and it takes action, right? Courage ties all of that stuff together. And action is where the difference is going to happen, because as we have the conversations, and the conversations are great to have, at the end of the day, you got to have a result. And the result only comes through action. And so as Jared talked about, you know, the political process, getting involved on a local level to change, you know, what the politics might look like in the city. We have to act, and I think you just start the conversation. You know, I talked to a friend of mine yesterday. I called him up and I said, look, I'm going to be doing this talk to this organization around this, because no organization at this point in time knows what to do. Everybody's kind of scrambling, right?
Right.
And I asked him, I said, so tell me, he's a physician, and you know who he is. He's a physician. And I said, so tell me, if I'm enter a room to have this conversation with a group of white people who make up this executive team, what do white people need to talk about but don't want to hear? And he says, you know, that's an interesting question. I can't answer that. Because what I'm asking for is from another white male to tell me, what do you need to hear, but you really don't want to talk about around this situation here? Mm-hmm. Because given that the population in this country is majority Caucasian, and given that the majority of the CEOs are white males or white women, then and when you go and look at the boards of directors of these organizations, you know what they look like, right? So what do they need to hear but don't want to hear, right? Because I think inclusion is very easy. It's something that you do. If I bring you into the organization, I should have a succession plan that you included two to three positions up the ladder. It may not necessarily mean you're going to become CEO, but I need to have that in place. And if I'm willing to hire you, then I should be willing to invest in you to promote you to at least a certain level. Because, you know, if I go back historically, the history of the Fortune 500, there have only been 13 CEOs since the beginning of the Fortune 500. At present, there are only 13 black CEOs. At present, there are only 2 black CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And so you mean to tell me that all of the African Americans that attended Harvard or MIT or Yale or Columbia University, you can't, across this globe, you can't find more than 13? Something's wrong. So we have to take a look at the power structure, right? Because it's really a thing about power and familiarity. But if you don't have the relationships and the reporting, you don't have the familiarity to say, hey, you know what, this guy right here, he has what it takes to be a leader. Let's take a look at Colin Powell and his history. He's talked many times about being an officer in the South and being stopped in the South when he came along in the military, right? Simply because he was black. But look at where he is. He could have potentially run for president if he so chose to, and he may have won, right? But you know, I think some things were done. but at any rate, it's a conversation that you just have, man. You can't, you know, it's the order versus justice. We're more interested in justice than we are in order, and there's no quote unquote order to revolution, right? You know, you got to revolt this way, you got to revolt that way. No, it's not that. And I think it's more of, let's just do it. That's what Nike said, right? Just have the conversation and begin the conversation. And people, the more you have it, the more people become comfortable with it.
Fair enough.
Here, jump in on your perspective on this and skew it from how you see it from a legal standpoint. I liked what you had said about the multiplicity of judicial legal systems we have, and you said there's some low-hanging fruit. So is there an example you might give us, a quick change that would be powerful?
Yeah, so I'm working in a jurisdiction right now that has a problem with how their cases are brought in. It's a jurisdiction where the police make all initial charges and ultimately set the bail. And so what's happening is the police, the arresting officers, are the ones making those charges, setting the bail. And then eventually it moves on to the prosecutor's offices. Well, not surprisingly, the interests of the arresting officer is different from the prosecuting team that knows what makes up a case, what is a legally sufficient case. The problem is people are being held on bail on cases that cannot be prosecuted for 30, for 60, for 90 days. Any day that anyone spends in a jail has massively detrimental effects to their socioeconomic well-being. They can lose their kids, they can lose their jobs. And so in this particular jurisdiction, there are, I believe, hundreds, we're still analyzing the data, but hundreds, if not thousands of people who this is happening to every year. And I think the fixes are pretty easy. We just need to be reviewing those cases much faster with an eye of releasing people who shouldn't be in the system. It's a procedural problem, but it can be addressed. So I think, and that's unique to this particular jurisdiction. I think it may not be unique. I think it may happen in a lot of jurisdictions. But where are those areas where everyone knows what the problem is? So we need to dedicate the resources to fixing those problems. I think in terms of having the conversations in our community, particularly for white men, for the power structure who has been there forever, it really requires some genuine curiosity. You have to be curious into the lives of and experiences of people who are different than you. As a prosecutor with the Department of Justice, I was lucky to travel across the country. I handled cases in 20 different jurisdictions and 3 U.S. territories, and got to be dropped into worlds that were entirely different to me. And I loved it. I loved being able to sit down and have a conversation with the person who worked in a meatpacking plant in Kansas, or a prison in Alabama, or was a victim of a hate crime in California. And what enabled me to be successful in building cases and developing witnesses who can make our cases was I was always truly curious into the lives and experience of the people that I came into contact with. I think as leaders, if you're trying to have a more diverse workforce, I think it is about more than just making sure you've got your 2 black guys and your 1 Asian guy and enough women to balance it out. It is about bringing in the people genuinely caring about what they say, genuinely caring and being curious about their experiences, and trying to adapt, because what I've seen time and time again is a massive amount of the problems in our society are based on misunderstandings that I think if we actually listen to each other from a point of curiosity, we'd be able to solve a lot of our problems.
Yeah. Go ahead, Terry. You said you look like you had a comment.
Yeah, there's some emotion tied to that conversation, especially around when you're talking about white men having the conversation. Right? I don't know if it's fear. I don't know if it's, I'm losing control. I'm not quite so sure what that is. However, there is a sense of, maybe that's what it is, a sense of loss of control, that everything that I've built, potentially I'm going to lose because I have to give this, a feeling that they have to give this share to someone. It's quite interesting because Tom Herman, who's the coach of the Texas Longhorns, had a very, very interesting statement that he made around all that's happened. He basically said, we love them on the field, we love them on the court, but we got to learn to love them when they're off the court. We got to realize that at some point in time, they may even date our daughters, right? And that's a realization that a lot of people don't want to come to, but it's real. And so I don't know how white men deal with that. I'll tell you, I was at the YMCA working out one day, and this guy kept talking to me about a baseball player that used to play, Roberto Clemente. He's a huge Roberto Clemente fan. And we got into conversation, and he said, I'm not prejudiced. I like everyone. I said, well, let me ask you a quick question. It's a white male. I said, let me ask you a quick question. How would you feel if your daughter came home with an African-American male? And there was total silence. He says, that's something I'm really going to have to think about. I said, yes, because you're telling me all these things, right? It's like, I love everybody, but if this particular situation happens, how will you actually feel? And I guess that goes from the whole, the phrase non-racist to being anti-racist, right? And then again to humanity, seeing everybody as human.
Well, and I'll flip this back to you, Jared. It's a good point. What it comes down to is our biases. And so, Jared, as you look at the legal system, there are institutional biases, but what's the greater problem? Is it personal bias or individual bias, or is it institutional?
I think it's institutional, but I think it's both. And I think, you know, for so long we've been tackling the overt racism, and what's happened is it's just shifted our conversation into, you know, it's not really about policing Black men in America. It's like it's about enforcing the law. These race neutral statements that are not race neutral in effect. I think we've got to worry about the institutions, because the institutions are also filled with people. And I think we're seeing less and less overt racism in the system, but that doesn't mean that it is not racial in what's happening. And I think there are a lot of people who, you know, in every hate crime case I ever prosecuted, the defendant always said, well, this is my Black friend. They always have the Black friend testify in every hate crime trial I ever did. Right? I'm not racist. I have a Black friend, but that doesn't. Right. But we need to differentiate. It is. Do we act in a way that is insensitive? Do we act in a way that doesn't consider other opinions? We need to think about, and then we make these decisions. We make, you know, as a prosecutor, I made 100 decisions every day. And while I don't think I was ever making decisions deliberately based on race in any way, there were certainly effects over time that we don't think about. And that is the institution. People making individual decisions are trying to do their best in any given situation. But collectively, over time, we make a lot of bad decisions, and those institutions perpetuate it, because we only have so much brain space. We only have so much ability to assess any given situation. So I think reforming the institutions, but also trying to have people be more conscious that I may be doing things that are having adverse racial effects, even if that's not my intent. And I think people are more open to having these conversations today than ever before. So I think that is a good trend. What I'm worried about is what we've also seen in the last 3 years is that a lot more of the overtly racist stuff is now back in vogue. So we've moved backwards in 3 years. And so I think there are communities of people who are outraged by it and want to speak up. And again, we've got to form teams, form communities, allies who are united around these ideas of how do we make our system more fair and more just for everyone.
Let me ask you, I had 2 questions, but something you said about there's definitely more overt racism now, and it's out there, and people are not embarrassed like they used to be to you know, share their views on it. How is it good to put that back in the box, or is it good that this is out in the open? And, I mean, does that make sense as a question? I mean, we all know, I mean, I think it hasn't been in a long time polite to be, I mean, I feel like we're ruder now. We're more in your face about some of this stuff. And it seems like it's in the last 3 years it's been okay. It's okay now to sort of share your views on things, even if they're appalling. Is it good that this is out in the open? Is it good that sort of things are out like they are now? Does that help our?
Well, I think it's easier. I think it's easier to confront for the rest of the people. You know, I think I was interviewing the Grand Dragon of the Klan for a case I had a few years ago. And as I was interviewing, he was telling me how he was not racist. And he explained all of his white supremacist ideas in non-racial terms. And I remember thinking, wow, that was impressive. Like, this is the Grand Dragon of the KKK rebranding for our modern times. And that's much harder to fight. It's the dog whistles that are much harder to fight. It's the reason we haven't addressed so many of these institutional problems, because it is easy to watch a video of George Floyd being killed and be outraged. It is much harder to be outraged by understanding that every day hundreds, thousands of people are arrested on false charges, released, but with massive detrimental effects on it. It's just harder to sustain that outrage.
Harder, yeah.
And it's the same with racism. It is easier. So maybe it is a gift. Maybe all the people who've been blowing on the dog whistle for all these years, now they've come out. Now it's easier to compartmentalize them.
And I think it gets to, Jared, something you said, and I know this is right up Terry, because I know I've heard him speak on this. And you mentioned the word intention. And so often we'll say, well, it's like, I didn't intend to do that. So what's the re-examination we need to do, Terry, about our intentions?
That's a good question. Re-examining our intentions. It has to be at the forefront of your thought. And I think that the George Floyd situation is having people to kind of reflect on how intentional they are about a lot of things. You know, I'm sure all of you familiar who Jesse Helms was, right, in North Carolina. I respected him because I knew where I stood with Jesse, right? And so as we talk about, is it okay for it to be out in the open, or do we try to put the genie back in the bottle? The genie is not going to go back in the bottle, but I welcome it being open because I want to know where I stand, right, with you. And I respect you for it, and then you'll know where you stand with me versus, you know, the guy who comes out the bushes all of a sudden to try to shoot you and run back in the bushes. There's a statement that says, you know, they'll throw the rock and then hide their hand. No, I want to see the hand that throws the rock. Then I know exactly who the opponent is, right? It's the subversive things that have been happening over years around employment, around banking, around housing, you know, around the criminal justice system. And Jared, you don't know this, but I was close to the criminal justice system for about 10 years. I got tired of corporate America because of the glass ceilings. And so as I started a bail bond business, I got a chance to see what the system was actually doing. And I had some friends who are attorneys, and they would whisper things in my ear. So I probably got more insight on the criminal justice system because I was close to friends who were attorneys. And even though I was in the industry that I was in, I had the opportunity to see and to get to know, you know, one of my college mates he was an assistant district attorney here in my city where I live. And so we were college mates. And so we could talk about a lot of things and how the system was. And when I decided to get out of that, it was because I became tired of seeing what the system was doing, at least what I thought the system was doing. I saw the double standards up close. I could see the charges because I was posting the bail, right? And I'm like, this is a $100,000 bail for this, and this person here did the same thing, and this is only $10,000. What's the difference? And you get a chance to see what the differences are. And I'm like, oh. And then, you know, I've seen people who were influential come and stroke a check. And in writing that check, I'm like, the normal people couldn't have done this. They wouldn't have been treated like this by the criminal justice system. They would have been just another number. And so I got tired and I said, well, let me get out in front of this, because at the end of the day, I think all of this is a leadership issue. It's a leadership issue from society. It's a leadership issue from corporate America. And diversity and inclusion and equity is not in place because there hasn't been real leadership who wanted to take this country through this kind of transformation so that everybody could be treated fairly regardless of what the hue of their skin was or what their ethnicity was, right? Or what their gender is. And look, this is at the very DNA of this country. Let's go back to how the Constitution was written. Let's talk about who was included and who wasn't included. White women had trouble voting too, right? You know, I sometimes go to this conversation, I said, in order to deal with this, we really have to deal with the fragility of the psyche of the white male. That's what has to be dealt with in order to get with this problem, because that's what it is, because the powers that be, for the most part, are white males. So how do we deal with the white male psyche in order to get the white male psyche to understand the challenges that are being presented to everybody simply because of what their thought process is around everybody?
Let me ask you this, both of you, and I'd like both of your thoughts on this. You think that when you see corporation after corporation now making statements in support of Black Lives Matter or the movement, are companies, I mean, I grew up, and I'll qualify this. I grew up, when I started my toy company, I remember my mother-in-law, she said, and she'd been a long-time business owner. She said to me, never come out for or against anything. You've got to be neutral. You can't wear your politics on your sleeve. You can't put a yard sign in the window of your business. Do you think that has changed now, where companies have to take a stand? And the second part of that question is, if they don't, do you think internally that's going to really be bad for the culture? If companies don't come out and take a stand on this?
I think they just need to be authentic. So if you're coming out and taking a stand, it's got to be real, because some of the stuff coming out these days, now everyone cares about racism and structural racism, and you're like, that's just a load of crap. And I hope those companies don't get any benefit from that. But there are genuine corporations who want to do better, who recognize that they have benefited from the capitalist system. I mean, we've got to understand that capitalism has winners and losers. That's the way our system is. And unfortunately, disproportionately, those losers are people of color and people who don't have as much opportunity as the rest of us. So what we need to be doing is creating more opportunities, whether or not that's creating more opportunities within your own company for people to rise and to have opportunities. If that's for putting money where your mouth is and helping communities of color or lower income communities have greater opportunities, whether it be in health or schooling or any of these or just economic opportunities, that's what we need. So I'm happy to see companies do it. I think it is in their interest ultimately, because it's more spending power, it's more customers, it's more loyalty. Will people protest against the people who don't? I don't know if they don't, but if you're going to do it, you should be authentic and you should be real about it.
I hope that employees hold these companies accountable to that, right? If you're going to come out and say, I mean, what I would hope is that you get held accountable for that.
Yeah, it just seems so often what you put on an implicit bias training internally, and that sort of goes on, or you create another really terrible 2-hour video that everyone has to watch once a year to check the box. I mean, I just joined 2 organizations at the same time and had to watch 4 hours of trainings about the same stuff. No, we need to have real conversations with real people. We need to be able to learn from each other. We need to be able to voice the slights, and we need to be able to do it in a way that we're not offended. I for many years used expressions that were offensive to people. I had no idea they were offensive, and I was telling my daughter about this the other day, and she said, "You didn't say that, did you?" And I said, "I did. I didn't know. I didn't know anyone back when I was a kid." Right. We need, number one, people need to be able to call you out on it when you do it, and we have to be receptive to being. Inclusion means being receptive to the needs of different people who are around us, and that's on us. That's on us as each individual to be receptive to critiques, and whether or not it's the fragility of the white man's ego or just fragility of people in general. We need to be more open to critiques so that we can be better and kinder and more effective, because ultimately teams that communicate like that are more effective.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean that. I
want to flip it to you then, Terry. So how is it that we, getting to Jared's point and what Rhett was saying, that what techniques have you found that help us listen more than go through the motions? What works? What do you advise your clients?
Well, I think initially you have to get their attention, because most of the time it's like, okay, here we go with another diversity and inclusion conversation. Here's another conversation about race, and nobody wants to hear it, right? And so what I do is I'll say, white men are killed 21, are likely to be killed 21 times more likely to be killed than black men by the police. I said, did you know that white men, there are 2 white men per week that are killed by the police? And you get their attention, right? And then I said, you know what? That's not true. Those statistics actually apply to African-American males. You know, it's that, if you remember the movie A Time to Kill, right, with Matthew McConaughey going before the jury and he asks them to close their eyes and he paints a scenario for them, right? And then he says, hey, that's not what it actually is. This is what it is. And so you draw them in with something that seems to be so perverse, but they would only be drawn in that way if it were something related to someone who looked like them, or you relate it to children, or if there's a African-American executive in the room, you point out him and say, what if it was his child? Because it's personal now, right? It's somebody that I actually know, and you get the attention and you get them to think, and you know, I don't want that to happen to his child. And so as a result, all of a sudden you begin to build a movement because they can personalize it versus just sitting in the ivory tower, you know, not being concerned, living behind the gate somewhere. You know, it becomes more normalized and personal because I've heard some statistics that I didn't know, right? I didn't know this kind of thing was happening because for the most part, unless you are involved in the criminal justice system, you're not really you're not paying attention to it because you're not involved with it. And you probably, maybe no one in your family has been through the system, right? So you don't pay attention to it. You read it in a newspaper, or you know, you hear a big story here and there, but if you're not really immersed in it, you don't pay attention to it. So you keep moving on because your life hasn't been impacted. It's only when your life is impacted that then, you know, you really want to do something about it. And people's lives have been impacted because they saw this on television. They saw this for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. They saw the guy, because plenty of people have said, I can't breathe. You know, it started with Eric Garner. And then you can go down the list of people, you know, you can talk about Walter Scott, right? Running away from the officer. And because I would ask myself, how is he a threat running away? This is clear cut. But then all of a sudden, there are certain cases, for whatever reason, you know, nobody's convicted. And so a person is dead. And then the person that we saw do it with our eyes, all of a sudden they get off. And so there's nobody held accountable, but there's a dead human being. So,
I was going to say, I mean, particularly as it relates to the examples that you gave, you know, what's interesting about the Walter Scott case is when that went before a state jury, it hung, even with that video. And it hung. It wasn't like there was one person on the fence. There were a good 6 people, according to some reports, who weren't convinced that video was a murder. And so what does that mean? You know, I think having the conversation, if you ask most white people, was your last interaction with the police good or bad, or tell me about your last bad interaction, you know, it's about the time they got pulled over and maybe they got a ticket. And that's the worst they can come up with. That is not the experience of pretty much every African American that I know, and I've interacted with very many in a lot of different places across the country. Get stopped by police more often. You're more likely to be arrested. You're more likely to wind up the victim of a use of force. And these are the experiences that are but for their race. They can't do anything about it. And those aren't our experiences. And so I think even being open to hearing about those experiences of your friends and your neighbors, so that you can establish a depth to that relation. I think it starts with the personal. Going back to a question that was asked earlier. I used to work for an organization that worked in the Middle East with Israelis and Palestinians, and the motto of that organization was make one friend. The idea was that if you could bring enough people together and you made one friend from the other side, that would somehow transform your worldview. And well, it didn't work every time. It worked a lot. And it's amazing what opening up yourself to real dialogue, real conversation with someone who's different than you can do. Whether it's on the issue of policing or poverty or health, we need to be genuinely curious and open to people who are different than us. And if you are willing, your perspective can be changed. You know, what I like to tell my kids is I'm going to tell you a whole bunch of things over life, but I promise you, I could be wrong. Like I accept the fact. I believe in many of these things strongly, but I could be wrong. I think we don't do that enough. We don't accept the fact that even in our strongly held beliefs, we could be wrong. And if you go into conversations with people who are different than you, and you accept that possibility and you receive the information with the hope of maybe making a friend, then I think we could get a lot farther as a society.
But, you know, you raised a very good point about that, you could be wrong, and I'll see what Terry says on that. It comes to a sense of one's own personal ego and one's sense of humility, because I think that's what's holding some of it. And Terry, I think furthest, is that holding us back from true understanding?
I think it is. You know, there's lots of things that's holding us back. Again, the lack of conversation to seek true understanding, right? And then to let your guard down and say, well, hey, you know, I don't know. I've never had this experience. You know, can you please tell me, you know, what it's like? And to be humble enough to say, hey, you know, I was wrong. You know, I've done this. I didn't know this. Man, how wrong I was about this. Let me give you a story. I remember years ago in high school, senior year, we were down on the beach. I'm amongst a bunch of friends, the majority of them white, and we're hanging out on the beach. And there was one young lady who came up to me. We had taken many classes from junior high through high school. And so she was really trying to understand, but it was a funny question that she asked me. She said, so Terry, tell me, how do you dry your hair? I said, with a towel, just like you do. But she honestly didn't know, right? Whatever narrative she had seen, whatever someone had told her, whatever her thought processes were, she thought that there was a different way that I dried my hair than she did, a hair dryer or a towel. But what I liked about it was that she had the courage to ask the question, because it was evidently eating her alive in order for her to ask the question, right? And the curiosity of trying to understand. I never forgot that. And when I see her, I always laugh and pick at her about that. But at least she asked a question. So she was seeking understanding. You have to be able to ask the question and a lot of people don't want to ask the question, especially white people, because there's a fear with it, right? And so it comes back to Jared's point of finding a friend that you can have those open and honest kind of conversations with, right? And no emotion, be attached to it, because it's simply from a matter of understanding, as John talked about humility. Hey, you know what, Terry, I really don't understand this. And you know, here's what my experience has been. What has your experience been as an African-American? And you can sense when it's truly about understanding, right? And you don't mind those kinds of questions, because guess what? I'm gonna have some of the same questions, right? I'm gonna have some of the same questions. And so as one human being with one experience, trying to understand another human being with a whole different experience. And that's what I tell people when I hear people say, well, I don't see color. I say, no, that's very dismissive, because my life's experience is based upon the hue of my skin. And if the hue of my skin was the same as you guys, my life experience would be different. I've often said that in my hometown. Given the people that I know, given what my connections are, given the MG 100, if I were a Caucasian male in Wilmington, my door would have been kicked in many times around, Terry, how can you help us with this business opportunity? Here's all of these opportunities. I remember saying to a friend of mine, I said, you know what, you have this radio show and I hear all these white men calling in telling you how intelligent you are. Let me ask you one question. How many of them have ever called you and asked you to be a part of a business deal that would make you wealthy? And he said, none. I said, that's the problem.
Mm-hmm. Guys, we've got to wrap up because we're out of time, but I do want to ask you one final question, and you've hit on several things today that are, I know, important. one of the themes I'm taking away today is that it's personal. It comes down to personal responsibility to ask questions, to change your heart, maybe open your heart to being wrong or having been wrong, to listening. What's one other thing that I can do as a leader of an organization, or just a leader of my family, a leader, just a human, that I can be better and understand more? What's one thing I can do? Is there one piece of advice you guys have both had unique experiences? And a quick answer from both of you so we can wrap up.
I think you call up someone who you're interested in, take them out to lunch back when we can do that again, or have a heart-to-heart call. Develop a relationship with someone who's different than you and has a different perspective, and try to develop relationships and see where it takes you.
I would agree with that, and I would also say, again, listening, right? Because the African American community has been screaming for years about this kind of thing. It just so happens that COVID slowed everything down, so now everybody is seeing. When someone is for most of the time, if Chicken Little said the sky is falling, the sky is falling, right? We have to take it serious, because that's an experience that someone actually had, and oftentimes those experiences are brushed under the rug. So call someone, make a new friend, and listen intently, and act. When you see something happening that shouldn't be happening, do something about it.
And I would end, Terry, I think the nice is an awful word. The thing with that this happened here, I think it's made us more aware, because I think it's very easy to become blind to what's happening, right? And at some point you just don't see it anymore. Mm-hmm. I think the things that are happening now, I think it has opened opened people's eyes, and I think that's a good thing. Yep. So thank you guys for being on the program today. This has been, I think, very helpful and very enlightening. And thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great. We'll close it out. Terry Jackson and Jared Fishman, thanks very much for being with us today. We have many more guests lined up for future What's Next episodes, so I invite everyone to stay tuned. We will continue to explore the issues that are creating our new normal, and one of them is racial justice, social justice, human rights for all of us. Thank you.